It is August 7th, 2026, and right now, somewhere between Muscat and Tehran, a single document is sitting unsigned that could either end the worst energy crisis of the decade or extend it by weeks nobody can afford. 3 days ago, Donald Trump stood in front of reporters traveling with him in California and said an announcement on the Strait of Hormuz could happen tomorrow or the next day. That was Tuesday. It is now Friday, and the deal still has not been signed. In the meantime, a Middle East expert has said something out loud that Iranian officials have spent months refusing to admit, and it explains almost everything about why this negotiation keeps collapsing at the finish line. Iran does not just want passage rights through Hormuz, Iran wants to monopolize it. And according to international affairs expert Rahman Ghahramanpour, that single word monopolize is the reason this war has not actually ended, even though everyone keeps saying it has. Let's start with what is happening this week, because the pace of this story right now is almost impossible to keep up with. On Wednesday, Iran's Deputy Foreign Minister, Kazem Garibabadi, told state media that Iran and Oman are in the final stage of drafting an agreement on new shipping routes through the strait. Sounds like good news. Except in the same breath, he said something that should have been the headline instead of the deal itself. He said the agreement with Oman would not, on its own, reopen the waterway. Read that again. The two coastal nations can agree on every technical detail in the world. Geographic coordinates for a safe shipping corridor, a joint coordination center to track vessel traffic, inbound and outbound lanes near Iran's Larak Island, and it still would not put a single tanker back through Hormuz unless the United States does something it has so far refused to do: lift its naval blockade on Iranian ports. That blockade has been running since April 13, and here's the trap both sides are stuck in right now. The United States is telling the world the strait is basically open, that a handshake with Oman is all that stands between the region and normal shipping again. Iran is telling the world the opposite, that as long as the U.S. Navy is sitting off its coast intercepting Iranian tankers, nothing it signs with Oman actually means anything, because safe passage requires more than a friendly neighbor. It requires the country doing the blockading to stand down first. Iran's foreign ministry spokesman, Esmail Bagay, put it plainly this week. He said an agreement between Iran and Oman alone cannot guarantee safe passage while the U.S. blockade and what he called other aggressive actions remain in place. So you have two governments, both telling their own populations that peace is close, while each one is quietly waiting for the other to blink first on the actual condition that would make peace real. Secretary of State Marco Rubio addressed this directly on Tuesday. He said there has been progress made, but not finality. That phrase, progress but not finality, is doing a lot of work. It means Washington knows the framework exists on paper. It also means Washington knows that paper does not solve the blockade problem, and until it does, calling this a resolved crisis is premature at best. Trump himself has now called Qatar's emir, Sheikh Tamim bin Hamad Al Thani, to talk through ways to de-escalate and bridge the remaining differences. Qatar, Oman, and Pakistan are all working the phones as mediators. Nobody has announced a final agreement. And while all of this diplomatic choreography plays out in five-star hotel conference rooms, the Houthis in Yemen claimed an attack on a Saudi oil tanker just yesterday, a reminder that the Strait of Hormuz crisis was never actually contained to the strait itself. It has metastasized across the entire Gulf. Now here's where we have to go back, because you cannot understand why this negotiation is stuck without understanding what actually happened to get here. And most coverage of this story treats it like it started last week. It did not. It started on February 28th, when the United States and Israel launched coordinated strikes on Iranian military targets, an operation that also killed Iran's supreme leader, Ali Khamenei. His son, Mojtaba Khamenei, was elevated to succeed him almost immediately, wounded, according to American and Israeli intelligence assessments, in the same strike that killed his father. In retaliation, Iran's Revolutionary Guard Corps Navy did something it had threatened for decades, but never actually followed through on. It shut the Strait of Hormuz, not slowed it, not restricted it, shut it. Warnings against passage, ships boarded and attacked, sea mines laid in the shipping lanes. Within weeks, shipping traffic through Hormuz had dropped by roughly 97%, according to experts tracking the numbers. 97% of a waterway that normally carries about 1/5 of the entire world's oil supply, gone almost overnight. The United States responded on March 19th with an aerial campaign specifically designed to reopen the strait by force, targeting Iranian naval vessels and drone assets along the coast. Israel assassinated the naval commander overseeing Iran's blockade operation, a man named Alireza Tangsiri. On April 13th, after ceasefire talks in Islamabad collapsed, the U.S. formally imposed a naval blockade on Iran's own ports, a mirror image of what Iran had done to the wider world. Both countries were now blockading each other simultaneously, and the global economy was caught directly in the middle. A temporary ceasefire came together on April 8th, hours before a deadline Trump had set, after he warned publicly that, in his words, A whole civilization would die tonight if Iran did not agree to end the war and reopen the strait. Oil prices, which had spiked toward $100 a barrel, dropped by nearly 16% within hours of that ceasefire announcement. That ceasefire has been extended, broken, threatened, and re-extended multiple times since. On May 17th, Trump warned Iran that the clock was ticking, and there would not be anything left of them if they did not move fast. The next day, he backed off an attack plan at the request of Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE. This is the rhythm this conflict has followed for 5 months now. Threat, brief opening, collapse, repeat. Then in July, the fragile truce broke down again after talks in Muscat failed to produce an agreement on the strait, and Iran resumed attacking oil tankers, prompting a military response from U.S. Central Command. Iranian state television announced on July 17th that the strait had been closed again by direct order of the IRGC Navy, and that no oil or gas exports would move through it as long as American forces remained active in the region. And this is the moment that tells you everything about how Tehran actually views this waterway. When Iran's parliament reconvened after a 137-day hiatus caused by the war, the very first bill it introduced was not about the economy, was not about reconstruction, was not about the tens of thousands of Iranians killed or displaced by 5 months of bombing. It was a bill titled, in translation, Strategic Action for Ensuring Security and Sustainable Progress in the Strait of Hormuz and the Persian Gulf. Before anything else, before rebuilding a single hospital, the regime legislated about a stretch of water. That tells you the strait is not a policy issue for the Islamic Republic. It is closer to a religious conviction. Which brings us to the deeper story here, the one underneath this week's headlines about Oman and shipping coordinates. Why does Iran care this much? Reza Merabian, Iran's former ambassador to Kuwait, laid out the hardline position clearly. He argues the United States used the 60-day window built into the original ceasefire memorandum to establish an alternative shipping corridor through Omani waters, specifically to bypass Iranian control, and that this was, in his words, a conspiracy to dissolve Iranian sovereignty over the strait entirely. In his telling, closing the waterway again was not aggression. It was Iran defending itself from what he calls an American attempt to quietly seize the choke point out from under Tehran's feet. Other Iranian officials go even further into economic warfare logic. A former director general at Iran's foreign ministry, Ahmad Sobhani, warned that losing control of the strait would leave Iran facing what he described as a scenario just like Gaza, followed by a massive invasion. His argument is that Trump has already violated the ceasefire memorandum repeatedly, and that Iran's only leverage against a full-scale assault is physically holding the world's most important oil choke point hostage. As he put it, when the strait is in Iran's hands, Iran holds leverage over the entire global energy supply. And then there is what analysts inside Iran are calling the Hormuz trump card, a strategy explicitly modeled on the cold winter narrative Russia used against Europe during the Ukraine war. International relations analyst Ali Vadai has argued that winter is approaching in the West, and that even a short closure of the strait during that window would paralyze both the United States and Europe on energy. Energy diplomacy expert Mehdi Arabzadeh went further, naming Qatar specifically. If Iran keeps the strait sealed and simultaneously blocks Qatari gas exports, in his assessment, both Europe and the U.S. face genuine blackout-level energy shortages. He has claimed that sustaining the blockade for 3 more months could permanently push oil prices toward $200 a barrel. Former ambassador to Lebanon and Jordan, Ahmad Das-Malkian, has pointed specifically at America's strategic petroleum reserve, arguing U.S. media reporting shows Washington has failed to replenish it during this entire crisis, meaning a few more weeks of blockade could push American reserves to what he calls critical crisis levels. Some of the rhetoric coming out of hardline circles in Tehran has crossed from economic pressure into something considerably darker. Iran's former ambassador to Russia, Mahmoud Reza Sajadi, has pushed for keeping the strait closed a full 3 months to cripple American industry and agriculture, and said the leverage should be preserved, in his words, even through violent methods if necessary, going as far as suggesting regional leaders in the UAE could be targeted directly. A media advisor to the IRGC commander-in-chief, Mohammad Reza Moghadamfar, has praised connecting the Hormuz blockade strategically to the Bab al-Mandeb Strait near Yemen, arguing that controlling both choke points simultaneously could shift the entire global balance of energy and security in Iran's favor. But here is the part of this story that almost never makes it into Western coverage, and it is the part that actually explains why this week's Oman negotiation keeps stalling on the edge of completion. Not everyone inside Iran agrees with this strategy. There's a real, documented split among Iran's own political and diplomatic establishment about whether holding the strait hostage is even working. Former UN diplomat Kourosh Ahmadi has stated flatly, that the Strait of Hormuz is simply not worth serving as the foundation for a total or even limited war, and that Iran cannot actually use the strait for any constructive purpose by keeping it closed. Political analyst Rasul Safrahan has argued the waterway can neither be legitimately nationalized nor sustainably militarized, and that any exit from this cycle requires accepting that international transit through Hormuz is simply not blockable long-term under any legal framework. And this is where Rahman Ghahramanpour's warning becomes the center of the entire story. Ghahramanpour has directly criticized the regime for turning the strait into what he calls an ideological identity issue, the same kind of absolutist rhetoric Iran once applied to its so-called nuclear rights. He argues that treating Hormuz as a tool of total deterrence traps Iran in a war of attrition against adversaries with vastly deeper economic and military endurance. And then he says the line that should be the headline of this entire 5-month crisis. Claiming exclusive administration over the strait violates the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea and is operationally impossible to sustain. His exact framing was that Iran should have pushed for a greater share in administering Hormuz rather than attempting to monopolize it, because monopolization is neither feasible nor compatible with international law. Sit with that for a second, because it reframes the entire Oman negotiation happening this week. Iran is not actually negotiating toward opening the strait. Iran is negotiating toward a version of control that still lets Tehran claim it decided who gets to pass and under what terms. The Oman deal, the Joint Coordination Center, the proposed inbound and outbound lanes, the closure of the temporary route near Larak Island, all of it is being built inside a framework where Iran still functions as gatekeeper, just with an Omani co-signature attached. That is not the same thing as reopening a choke point to unrestricted international transit. It is Iran attempting exactly what Ghahramanpour warned against, dressing up an attempt at monopolized control in the language of a cooperative maritime agreement, hoping the world accepts the appearance of openness without the substance of it. This is also precisely why the U.S. blockade has not been lifted, and why Rubio's phrase, progress but not finality, is the most accurate 2 words anyone in Washington has said about this crisis all week. The Trump administration has previously and explicitly ruled out any deal that would cement Iran's grip over the strait, calling it a break with global norms that Washington will not accept. So you now have 2 governments approaching the same piece of water with fundamentally incompatible end states. Iran wants an arrangement where it retains effective administrative control, dressed as bilateral cooperation with Oman. The United States wants genuinely free, internationally guaranteed transit that removes Iran's ability to use the strait as leverage ever again. Both sides can announce progress this week. Neither side has actually agreed to the other's real objective. That gap, not a missing signature, not a scheduling issue, is the actual reason this deal keeps almost happening and never quite happens. Meanwhile, the human and economic cost of this standoff keeps compounding on the ground inside Iran itself. Reporting from inside the country describes missile damage, a collapsing fuel supply chain, and deepening poverty specifically devastating Iran's own fishing and coastal communities, the very people who live closest to the strait Tehran insists it is defending on their behalf. Basic staples like sangak and lavish bread have become, according to on-the-ground reporting, luxury items for ordinary Iranian families. The Strategic Petroleum Reserve argument being used by hardliners like Desmalkian cuts both ways, because Iran's own economy depends on the same waterway it has weaponized. And every week, the standoff continues. Iranian civilians absorb the cost of a strategy that a growing number of the country's own former diplomats now openly say cannot work. Let's talk numbers for a second, because the abstraction of a closed strait does not hit the same way as the actual scale of what has been sitting frozen in the Persian Gulf for 5 months. Before this crisis, roughly 17 to 21 million barrels of oil moved through Hormuz every single day, somewhere between 1/5 and 1/4 of everything the entire planet consumes. Qatar alone ships more liquefied natural gas through that same corridor than any other country on Earth, meaning this is not just an oil story, it is a heating and electricity story for import-dependent economies across Asia and Europe. When traffic collapsed by roughly 97% in the opening weeks of the crisis, insurance premiums for any vessel still willing to attempt the transit reportedly spiked by as much as 400% within weeks, according to analysts tracking maritime risk. Think about what that actually means for a shipping company. Even if a tanker captain was willing to risk the mines and the IRGC patrol boats, the cost of simply ensuring that single voyage became prohibitive for all but the most desperate or the most subsidized operators. That is a blockade enforced by economics as much as by military force, and it is part of why traffic has been so slow to recover, even during the brief ceasefire windows. China deserves its own mention here. because it has been almost entirely absent from Western coverage of this crisis, despite being arguably the single largest economic stakeholder in how this ends. China imports more crude oil through the Strait of Hormuz than any other nation on the planet, and Beijing has said remarkably little in public throughout 5 months of blockades, strikes, and stalled negotiations. That silence is not indifference. Analysts who track Chinese energy strategy note that Beijing has spent years deliberately diversifying import routes and building strategic reserves, specifically to insulate itself from exactly this kind of choke point crisis, a hedge that is now being tested in real time. If Iran does succeed in negotiating a Hormuz arrangement that leaves it functioning as de facto gatekeeper, dressed in the cooperative language Ghahramanpour warned about, China is one of the few global powers positioned to simply accept that outcome and route around Washington's objections entirely, because Beijing does not share Washington's stated concern about the precedent of a state effectively administering a choke point recognized under international law as a strait used for international navigation. Now let's go back to Ghahramanpour's argument one more time, because there's a second layer to it that gets lost if you only focus on the legal point about the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. His deeper argument is about strategy, not just law. He is telling Iran's own leadership, from inside the country, that treating Hormuz as what he calls a tool of total deterrence is a trap of Iran's own making. The logic runs like this. A blockade only works as leverage if the blockading country can sustain the economic pain of enforcing it for longer than its adversary can sustain the pain of being blockaded. Iran's own coastal and fishing communities are already absorbing devastating losses. Iran's own currency and fuel supply are already strained by a war that has run for 5 months with no clear military resolution. Meanwhile, the United States, despite hardline claims about a depleted strategic petroleum reserve, has global alternative supply relationships, strategic partnerships with Gulf producers who are not Iran, and a navy actively enforcing a counter-blockade on Iranian ports specifically. Ghahramanpour's point, in plain language, is that Iran picked a fight over economic endurance against an opponent with substantially more of it, and dressed that miscalculation up as a principled stand on sovereignty. This is also exactly why the internal Iranian debate matters so much more than most coverage gives it credit for. When a former Iranian ambassador to the United Nations, a former ambassador to Russia, a former ambassador to Kuwait, and a sitting international relations analyst are all publicly disagreeing about the same strategy in the same month, that is not background noise. That is a fracture inside the foreign policy establishment of a country currently negotiating the terms of its own economic future. Sajjadi wants 3 more months of blockade and is willing to talk about targeting regional leaders to sustain it. Ghahramanpour is telling the regime the entire premise is operationally impossible under international law and will simply exhaust Iran faster than it exhausts anyone else. Ahmadi says bluntly that the strait was never worth a war in the first place. These are not fringe voices shouting into the wind. These are former ambassadors and senior policy analysts, the exact people whose job it is to tell leadership uncomfortable truths. And right now, they are telling Tehran that the hardline faction's Hormuz strategy is a strategic dead end, even as that faction continues driving the actual negotiating posture in Muscat. And that split explains something that has puzzled outside observers for weeks now, why Iran keeps sending mixed signals in the same 24-hour news cycle. One day, a deputy foreign minister says a deal with Oman is in its final stage. The next day, a foreign ministry spokesman insists that deal changes nothing without the blockade lifting first. That is not incompetence. That is 2 competing factions inside the same government, one that wants to close this out and get sanctions relief flowing, and one that wants to preserve every ounce of leverage the strait still provides, both speaking through the same state media apparatus in the same week. Every statement out of Tehran right now has to be read as a negotiation between Iranian factions, just as much as a negotiation with Washington. There's also a timing element here that deserves more attention than it has gotten. Remember the Cold Winter narrative. The strategy explicitly modeled on Russia's playbook against Europe during the Ukraine war. That strategy only works on a calendar. Threatening an energy squeeze in August carries almost none of the leverage that the same threat carries in November or December, when heating demand spikes and reserves that were drawn down all summer suddenly matter enormously. Every week, this negotiation drags without resolution, pushes the calculation closer to a window where Tehran's hardline faction gains exactly the seasonal leverage analysts like Ali Vadai and Mehdi Arabsadegh have been openly counting on. That is very likely part of why Washington is pushing so hard for an announcement this week specifically, and part of why Trump keeps publicly naming days, tomorrow, Wednesday, Thursday, rather than letting this slide into an open-ended process. The diplomatic clock and the seasonal energy clock are now running against each other, and both sides know it. So where does that leave the next 72 hours? Because that is genuinely the window everyone involved is now operating inside. Trump said Tuesday or Wednesday. It is now Friday. Garibabadi says Iran and Oman are in the final stage of drafting. Qatar's prime minister has publicly stressed that any agreement must preserve, in his words, the gains already achieved while strengthening regional stability. Careful diplomatic language, for don't let this collapse again. The Emir of Qatar took a direct call from Trump this week specifically about bridging the remaining gap. Every mediator in this process, Doha, Muscat, Islamabad, is working simultaneously, which tells you how urgently everyone wants this finished, and also how difficult finishing it has proven to be for 5 straight months. The honest answer to whether this ends this week is that nobody outside the negotiating room actually knows, and anyone telling you with total confidence that the strait reopens by Monday is guessing. Watch 3 specific things over the coming days, because they will tell you which direction this is actually heading faster than any official statement will. First, watch whether Washington says anything at all about the specific structure of the Joint Coordination Center Iran and Oman are proposing. If the U.S. publicly endorses that structure, it suggests Washington has accepted some version of continued Iranian administrative involvement, a quiet concession to exactly the outcome Ghahramanpour warned about. If the U.S. stays silent or pushes back on it, that is a sign the blockade is not coming off anytime soon. Second, watch oil markets themselves. Traders price in expectations faster than diplomats announce them, and a sustained drop in crude prices this week would tell you the market believes a real reopening is close, while a market that stays jittery despite all the optimistic headlines is telling you something the diplomats are not saying out loud. Third, watch whether Iran's hardline factions, the Sajadi and Moghadamfar wing of this argument, go quiet or get louder. If hardline voices calling for extended blockades start dominating Iranian state media again this week, that is a strong signal the diplomatic track led by Garibabadi and Araghchi is losing the internal argument, regardless of what gets announced in Muscat. There is one more piece of this that rarely gets discussed but genuinely deserves to, and it is about precedent. If Iran does succeed in negotiating a version of Hormuz control that survives this crisis largely intact, cooperative in name, exclusive in practice, it will not just be a regional outcome. It becomes a template. Every country sitting on a strategic maritime choke point in the world, and there are more of them than people realize, will be watching exactly how this plays out. Egypt in the Suez Canal, Turkey in the Bosphorus, Malaysia and Indonesia on the Strait of Malacca, Djibouti near Bab al-Mandab. None of those situations are identical to Hormuz, but the underlying question is the same one Ghahramanpour raised about international law. Can a state that controls one shore of an international strait effectively convert cooperative administration into functional monopoly control and get the rest of the world to accept it because the alternative is prolonged economic pain for everyone? If Iran pulls that off here, even partially, it rewrites an unspoken rule that is held for decades, and that is precisely why the Trump administration has drawn as hard a line as it has on this specific point, even while accepting a ceasefire, even while negotiating through 3 separate mediators, even while taking direct calls from Qatar's emir, trying to talk everyone off the ledge. What makes this moment different from the last 5 months of near misses is that both sides now appear to genuinely want an announcement, not just a temporary pause. Trump wants a deliverable he can point to as proof the war is actually over, rather than merely paused for the 4th or 5th time. Iran's diplomatic faction wants sanctions relief flowing before the internal economic pressure documented in places like Iran's fishing communities and its collapsing bread supply chain becomes politically unmanageable for the government in Tehran. Oman wants the credit and the regional standing that comes from brokering the deal that finally stuck. Qatar wants the crisis off its doorstep before winter energy demand turns this into a European emergency as well as a Middle Eastern one. Every party at the table has real incentive to get this done. The only question left, the one Ghahramanpour's warning cuts straight through, is whether what gets signed actually reopens the strait to the world or simply repackages Iranian control and language soft enough for both governments to call it a win. That is the story underneath the story this week. Not whether an announcement comes Wednesday or Thursday or slips into next week, but what that announcement actually contains when it finally lands. A genuine international transit agreement looks very different on paper from a bilateral Iran-Oman framework that leaves Tehran holding the same leverage it has held all along, just with better public relations attached to it. Right now, based on everything Iranian officials themselves have said this week, the second version is what is actually being drafted in Muscat, not the first. A technical agreement between Iran and Oman on shipping coordinates does not resolve the underlying dispute. The U.S. blockade stays in place until Washington is satisfied Iran cannot use the strait as a weapon again. Iran will not fully accept that condition unless it retains enough administrative involvement to claim it never actually surrendered sovereignty over the waterway. And the expert whose warning started this entire story, Rahman Ghahramanpour, has already told anyone paying attention exactly how this ends if Iran's hardline faction gets its way. It does not end, It just changes shape. A monopoly Tehran calls cooperation, a blockade Washington calls leverage, and a waterway carrying 1/5 of the planet's oil sitting in the middle of both claims, waiting for someone to actually blink.